Hi, my name is Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the reports on the eye-watering level of borrowing that the Conservative government is going to have to get ready to carry out in order to get us through the upcoming Brexit and COVID economic upheaval, and how it has been made worse by that Brexit mentality. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. Now, before I go over the concerns here, this isn't about, oh, debt is bad, borrowing is bad, and the more it is, the worse it is. From me, what matters for me is how much debt is necessary. I don't deny that borrowing is necessary, particularly in a time like this, or indeed at any time. At the end of the day, when you hit a major economic shock, you are supposed to borrow to keep the economy strong. This is why austerity is economically illiterate. The way governments try to push that, such as the Tory government of the past 10 years, is likening it to tightening your belt in tough times. They're like, oh, if you lost some of your income, of course, you'd have to tighten your belt. That's all austerity is. But no. Because tightening your belt on a personal level, when your own finances are a bit reduced, means taking a hit by doing without certain luxuries, maybe your foreign holiday, or maybe you cut back on the quality of essentials. So you can't get the snacks and things like that. You just concentrate on the food that you need, and you maybe don't have the heating on, you put a jumper on, that sort of thing. What austerity was keeping the luxuries, like tax breaks for the wealthy and wasting public money on shrinking government, which is what David Cameron later admitted was the whole point of austerity, and doing without essentials like investment in healthcare. So then you get massive waiting lists, which of course come too late for some people. Education, so then you lower the skill set of school leavers. Social care, so you have a less productive workforce because they're not being looked after. And employment, so you have lower overall productivity and also smaller tax receipts. But borrowing at a time like this, absolutely expected. Keynesian economics essentially says you borrow in the hard times, spend it on infrastructure, and then pay it back in terms of growth in between. So that then when the next shock comes along, you're in a good place to do the same again. And you can just keep doing that. So our last shock, of course, was in 2008. The Labour government at the time borrowed and invested in infrastructure. This was working. Then the Conservatives came in and used their borrowing just to shovel money into the hands of the already wealthy. And the results were fairly obvious because it meant two things about employment. One, unemployment increased. Two, wages stagnated, actually going down in real terms in many sectors of the economy. And the end result of this was that wage earners were earning lower wages and so paid less tax. But they also needed more state help. So from the government's point of view, certainly the Treasury's point of view, their income went down because tax receipts were down, and their costs went up due to more being needed in benefits. So even though GDP increased, we didn't really see the benefit in the country as much as had we had different fiscal policies, because the wealth generated wasn't pumped back into the economy. A lot of it was squirreled away into offshore tax havens. But even if it wasn't being spent. The trickle-down theory is a complete con trick. Now, it's not like the extra earning on the part of the wealthy helped, because, like I say, they weren't spending it. That section of the population who made more money paid little to no taxes to Her Majesty's Treasury. So, a couple of graphs. The first chart here is the actual debt year on year in trillions of pounds. Now, it's just kept going up and up and up. And what should have happened is you would expect it to go up over a few years and then to come down again as you pay it off in better times. As happened with Germany, those levels came down. And so Germany are also going to be borrowing a fair amount, not necessarily as much as us, but they are going to be borrowing heavily to deal with the current situation that the EU in general is. But because in Germany's case they dealt with 2008, they're in a good position to do so again. And so that Keynesian cycle, can continue for Germany allow you to borrow to support your economy in those hard times, and then get back to that base position during better times to be ready for the next shock. We can't. But what people often talk about, of course, in terms of debt is not our overall levels of debt, because you can't really then compare different countries. It's national debt as a proportion of GDP. That makes sense, of course, because, you know, if you're generating more wealth, you can afford to borrow more. So as long as your GDP grows at a good rate, you can afford to maintain a bit of borrowing. Yeah, no problem, we get that. But that debt as a proportion of GDP is even worse. You know, that has just kept on rising. So we were borrowing out of proportion to growth is the key thing. And GDP did grow. Not that that was static. But although, like I said, we didn't get the benefit for it. So, you know, we borrowed for too long. We were borrowing too much for too long. And so along comes another crash and we're going to have to borrow heavily again. But we didn't deal with it last time. And this is going to now mean that our overall national debt will shoot past the 2 trillion mark this year. Reports are saying, you know, based on Rishi Sunak's announcement, that the government are going to have to borrow £350 billion this year. Now, I'm not going to try and show what that would look like on a debt per GDP scale for two reasons. One, it would mean using a GDP forecast, because we can work out how much borrowing is going to be needed, because Rishi Sunak has announced spending promises. Obviously, it can be worked out how much borrowing is going to be needed for those spending promises. We can't work out what the 2020 GDP overall is going to be. You'd have to use a forecast, which is tricky because we still don't know what the rest of 2020 has in store for us. Poisoned flying pigs, no doubt. And secondly, I actually don't think it's fair because, of course, it's going to look really bad. GDP will have come down this year. Debt will have gone up. So the debt to GDP will look monstrous. Of course it will. We've closed down our economy and we're going to keep having to close down bits of it as well because we've made an arse of everything. When it will start to be fair is in 2021. That's when it will be fair. But of course, we're not going to know what it's like until 2022, well into 2022, so a couple of years to go. So the point is that the overall level of debt, which has to be serviced, so obviously when you're looking at those tax receipts, which are always low with Conservatives because they don't tax as much, when you're looking at those tax receipts, before you can spend any of it on public services and infrastructure, you've got to service your debt. So there's going to be a bigger chunk of our taxes and future generations' taxes, more importantly, servicing that debt. Now, that's going to be higher than it should be, because that's the key thing. Not that there's going to be a lot of borrowing, that it's going to be higher than it should be for three self-inflicted reasons. The first one is that the Conservative government did not manage the economy well over the past decade. So our base position of national debt was already very high at the start of this new crisis. The second one is that the amount of borrowing is higher than it should be because we are wasting public money on privatisation when we should invest in public services. And also because the government are continuing to mismanage the economy due to, for example, their premature ending of the furlough scheme. Of course, they could change that, but at the moment they're planning on doing that. Economic reports suggest this is actually going to hurt the economy. And of course, the Brexit mentality as well, which has already cost us quite a lot. In fact, it's already meant, onto the third one, our Brexit mentality means that we are no longer seen as safe a bet as we once were. Our credit rating has gone down. That is a reflection on how keen people are to invest in us, to buy our bonds. So our cost of borrowing has gone up as well. So it's going to cost the UK more to borrow that 350 billion than it would have done a few years ago. Again, that means more, that the borrowing has got to be higher than it otherwise would be. That is also related very heavily with Brexit. And that 350 billion pounds, by the way, isn't even expected to be the end of it. That is just based on what Rishi Sunak has announced. If that is considered an optimistic appraisal, given what's in store in the rest of 2020, what about the prospects of a second COVID wave thrown into the mix, which is not really being accounted for here. In addition, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has said that some of the measures announced by Rishi Sunak this week were poorly targeted. In other words, they weren't a good use of public money. So they cited as examples property tax and VAT cuts. Now, of course, we know the reason for the cuts in stamp duty, property tax. It's got nothing to do with the housing market, to try and drag the housing market on. It's entirely a way of giving wealthy people a tax cut. That's what that's about. Upper middle class people, giving them a tax break. But the reduction in VAT for the hospitality sector, now that might have made more sense. It would have done to me, but going to be honest, because you think, well, the hospitality industry really badly hit by COVID. Of course it is, and continues to be. So you'd sort of think any help there would sort of be good. But what the IFS noted was actually, no, you don't need to do that, because the reason it's so badly hit, of course, is the lockdown. Now, a VAT cut isn't going to help them when you can't do business at all anyway. So the help is for when they're getting back on their feet. But this is an industry that can ramp itself up overnight. You know, a bar or a restaurant can be back up to full business as soon as it's allowed to be. Whereas they'd be better off targeting it at businesses where they can't do that, where they'll be allowed to trade again, but there'll be a lead up time where they could really do with that reduction in VAT. So the VAT reduction and the free restaurant vouchers are not seen as a good way to stimulate the economy by expert economists. I'll bet the coronavirus is loving it, though, all those people in those restaurants. It might have been different if it was used to encourage takeaways, they said, rather than in-house dining. Now, I'd like to be fair, of course. Rishi Sunak he's made decisions, he's made policy decisions. Let us see what happens with them, because we are in extraordinary times. I'm fine with that. However, when what he's done is against the advice of his own Treasury officials and has drawn criticism from the IFS as well, and even by his own admission, when it was put to him by Annalisa Dodds, his counterpart in Labour, that his measures are poorly targeted, he accepted that. You know, he accepted that. So against a background of that, you're really going to think, yeah, borrowing is definitely going to exceed projections. And when someone soberly looks at it, they are going to see that it was not the best use of public money. Now, on that point, I will also just say that Sunak, when responding, did say, he didn't just say, oh yeah, my measures are poorly targeted and leave it at that. Of course, you wouldn't say that. He said he would like them to have been better targeted, not denying his scattergun approach, but he says that there wasn't time. Now, I wonder why that is. Because is there insufficient time because they weren't working out the different scenarios far enough in advance, for example? I mean, they've had months to do this. Or is there insufficient time because the Treasury is in chaos due to a combination of Dominic Cummings interfering with everything and Treasury officials wasting their time on a constantly changing Brexit landscape? Because that is the key. If there's insufficient time due to factors outside of the government's control, then fair enough. But I don't believe that's the case. Because I happen to know, of course, that civil servants throughout the civil service are working flat out on Brexit. And particularly in the Treasury. So in that case, it is absolutely reasonable to say that the reason they've got insufficient time is because of government failing. So it's their failings that mean that we're not targeting that public money more effectively, which means we're going to have to borrow more and get less effect from it. If, for example, the transition period had been extended, then Treasury officials could have focused all of their efforts on dealing with the pandemic. Forget Brexit. Stop Brexit. Focus everything on the pandemic. Worry about Brexit later. So the fact that Sunak didn't have the resources to better target help is, if not down to him directly, then down to the government that he is willing to be a part of. And you also don't get to plead poverty when arguing against feeding starving kids or making NHS workers pay extra transport costs when you give well-off middle-class people vouchers to spend on eating out at restaurants. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.